The first thing I noticed was that they were upside down. 3 of them hanging from the underside of a collapsed cargo shelf in the wreckage of Bay 7, their long iridescent limbs curled against their torsos like sleeping bats. The emergency strips along the floor threw a red wash across everything, and in that light, their skin, if you could call it skin, moved with slow bioluminescence, pale greens and deep violets pulsing in rhythms the way a jellyfish pulses in deep water. They were breathing, all 3 of them. Just hanging there, unconscious, in the guts of a ship that had been declared dead for 11 hours. I stood in the hatchway for a long moment with my cutting torch in one hand and my emergency O2 relay in the other. I thought I should report this. Then I thought to whom. Comms had been down since the impact. The Herring, UES Herring, salvage tender class, 22 crew, had been struck by a debris cluster from the Kalen station breakup at 3:40 station time. 8 confirmed dead in the first 6 minutes. 6 unaccounted for in the chaos of the breach. Chief Warrant Dollars Vance had declared the aft section uninhabitable at hour 2, ordered all remaining personnel forward, and sealed the connecting hatches. I had been crawling through Bay 7 specifically to recover the atmospheric regulators from the sealed supply crates, because we needed them to keep the forward section breathable for the next 72 hours until the rescue shuttle arrived. I had not expected to find aliens. I had, in my 23 years of salvage work in the outer transit corridors, never found anything alive that wasn't supposed to be there. Dead things, yes. Contraband in every configuration you could imagine and some you couldn't. Once, memorably, a dog of unclear provenance, tucked into a sealed crate that was manifested as spare gaskets. But not 3 aliens hanging upside down from a collapsed shelf in the dark, breathing slowly, pulsing with color, entirely unconscious and entirely out of place. I turned off my torch, because the instinct was to go quiet, and then I stood there in the red emergency light and looked at them and tried to remember everything I knew about Varese. Which was, by any honest accounting, not much. I knew they were spider-adjacent in body plan. 6 limbs instead of 4, the upper 2 of which could function as arms or legs depending on orientation, with 2 smaller secondary limbs at the midpoint of the torso that served as fine manipulation tools, and as I understood it, primary tactile communication organs. I knew they were migratory in a way that didn't map cleanly onto any human concept of migration. They moved between systems on long, slow arcs following resource and energy lines, the way old Earth birds had followed magnetic fields. But the arcs spanned decades, and the roots were passed down through generations of bioluminescent memory encoding that I had read about in one academic paper and not understood at all. I knew they communicated partly in bioluminescent pattern and partly in subsonic vibration that humans couldn't hear without specialized equipment, and that the 2 channels weren't interchangeable but complementary, different registers of the same language the way tone and syntax are different registers of spoken English. I knew they had been present in the outer transit corridors for about 60 years, contact established in a series of careful encounters that had taken 2 decades, and left both sides with a mutual understanding roughly equivalent to knowing that someone exists and means you no harm. I knew that in those 60 years there had been approximately 4 confirmed violent incidents between Varese and humans, all of which had started with a human doing something stupid, and none of which had escalated beyond the initiating incident. I was standing in the dark trying to decide if what I was contemplating counted as doing something stupid. Her name was Myra Osai, the Varese I'd met before. Not her real name was a pattern of light and low-frequency sound that translated, roughly, into something like the one who tends the bridge or possibly the one who holds the crossing point, depending on who was doing the translation and which database you consulted. But she had given me Myra Osai to use the way people give you a nickname when your actual name is genuinely difficult for the other party's physiology to produce. And I had used it for 3 years of loose trading partnership in the outer lanes before the herring had been reassigned, and we'd lost contact. Myra Os had been the one who saved my life. I hadn't thought about that much lately. The mind tucks things away when there's work to do, when the years stack up and the list of things that need attending to gets long enough that old memories slip to the bottom of the pile and stay there. I thought about it now, though, standing in Bay 7 with 3 unconscious Varesi above me and a torch in my hand, and a decision to make. It came back in the specific sensory detail that only real memories have, the kind that hasn't been retouched by repetition or softened by time. The smell of burning composite, the sound my leg had made when the cargo lock had caught it, a sound I had never heard a human body make before and that I hoped, sincerely, never to hear again. The darkness of sublevel 4 on Risa Station, when the power had cut in the middle of the evacuation, and the emergency doors had sealed with me on the wrong side of them, pinned under a shifted rack that had caught my leg at the knee in a way that made standing not an option, and crawling a project that would take longer than the atmosphere would hold. And then the light. A faint phosphorescent light, moving through the dark. Not the emergency red I was surrounded by now, but something softer and stranger. A gentle pale cycling of greens and blues that had appeared at the far end of the corridor like a hallucination, and then moved steadily closer. She had found me by following the heat signature of my suit. She had cut through 2 locked emergency doors with tools I had never seen and still couldn't name, tools that the databases later described as Varesi bonding cutters, used in their construction and repair work, sized for secondary limbs and entirely not designed for human-built infrastructure, but functional on it anyway when the person using them knew what they were doing. She had spent 20 minutes helping me drag myself through a corridor that was losing atmosphere at a rate that was going to become fatal in the next 2 hours, and she had not said a word, not one word, not one light pulse I could interpret as communication, until we had reached the emergency airlock at the end of the sublevel and sealed it, and I had managed to get my legs stabilized with the supplies in my kit, and the adrenaline had begun its long crawl back out of my system. Then she had settled across from me in the small space, and I had looked up at her, and I had tried to find something adequate to say, and what came out was, "Thank you," just that. Very simple because that was all there was. She had looked at me with her 4 primary eyes for a long moment. Then she had reached out with one of her secondary limbs, the right one, and pressed the tip of it against the inside of my left wrist, very lightly, just the very tip. She had held it there for about 3 seconds. And then she had turned and palmed the airlock open and walked out into the station. And by the time I had gotten the hatch sealed behind her, she was gone in the way things go in corridors. Around a corner, out of a sight line, simply no longer visible. I hadn't understood the gesture at the time. I had tried, in the way you try to understand something that feels important even before you know why. I had run searches in the databases I could access from my recovery berth, working through terminology and cultural practice indices that were incomplete and sometimes contradictory, and I had eventually arrived at a description, a Varesi gesture of acknowledgement between parties who have survived a significant event together. Not quite the same semantic space as gratitude, not quite the same as farewell. Something that crossed both and sat between them. Something in the register of, I was here. You were here, we are both still here, which means something. There was a mark on my wrist where she had touched me. Not a scar. Varesi's secondary limbs secreted a mild bioluminescent compound as a natural function of physical contact, a function that served multiple purposes in Varesi culture and biology, and in the right light, if I held my wrist at the correct angle, I could still see a faint tracing there. It had never fully faded. I had asked a doctor about it once early on, who had examined it and found nothing pathological, and told me it was essentially cosmetic and harmless. I had asked a Varese cultural specialist about it 2 years later, who had gone quiet for a moment, and then said that she wasn't fully current on the meaning of the specific application, but that she thought it might be significant, and that I might want to follow up with someone who knew more. I had followed up with 3 people who knew more, and all 3 had given me overlapping but not identical explanations, and the sum of what I had understood was that the mark meant something real in Varese terms, and that I had, without knowing it, been incorporated into some kind of mutual acknowledgement structure that had obligations on both sides, and that I didn't know what those obligations were, and neither, apparently, did the cultural specialists I had talked to. After a while I had stopped trying to fully understand it and simply kept it. The mark was real, she had been there, we had survived, that seemed like the core of it. I looked at that mark now, in the red emergency light of Bay 7, and I made my decision. I pulled up a supply crate, set it upright on the floor, sat down on it, turned off my torch completely and waited. The first one came around about 20 minutes later. It was subtle initially, a shift in the rhythm of the bioluminescence along his skin, the patterns going from the slow, lazy pulse of deep unconscious to something faster and more irregular, the way you can see a dreamer's REM through closed eyelids if you're watching closely. I watched the limbs uncurl slightly and then tighten again, saw the secondary limbs twitch, and I kept very still and kept my hands visible, both of them, because I had learned from Myra Osai and from the databases I'd read afterward that Varese perceived the secondary limbs, and by extension human hands, as the closest analog, the way humans perceived faces, the primary site of intention and emotional state. If your hands were hidden, you were hiding something. If they were visible, you were present. He woke up the way you wake up when you're not sure where you are, all at once and then very slowly taking stock of each piece of information in sequence. Where my body is, what is touching it, what the air is, what the light is doing, what is in front of me. He reoriented, which from a Varese perspective meant settling into a posture, since they had no innate preference for any one orientation, and his 4 primary eyes found me immediately. The amber of his resting light deepened and quickened as awareness came online. We looked at each other. I held up my left wrist. Not dramatically, not as a statement, just turned it so the inside faced him where the mark was and let the emergency red strip light fall across it. It was barely visible, the mark. I didn't know if he would see it from that distance, but it was what I had, so it was what I offered. The amber deepened, then shifted toward something I might have called gold if I was being imprecise, a warmer frequency, a longer wavelength. He was very still for a long moment, absolutely, completely still in a way that felt different from simple stillness, felt like the stillness of active processing rather than absence. And then one of his secondary limbs extended very slowly in my direction, oriented toward my wrist, and I understood he was trying to see it better. I turned my wrist slightly, so the light caught the inside more directly. He made a sound below my hearing threshold. I felt it more than heard it, a vibration in my sternum and the base of my jaw, brief and complex. Above me, the other 2 stirred. The second one came awake faster. She cycled through the same confused blaze of color, and then oriented and found me. And I saw the moment she registered my wrist because there was a specific pattern, 3 quick pulses of white in rapid sequence, like a blink of shock, that I had seen Myra Osai produce exactly once, on a different occasion, when she'd encountered a navigation marker from a Varese cooperative she knew. It was the visual equivalent of a sharp, involuntary intake of breath. Something recognized, something not expected to be here, something that required a moment. I kept very still and let the moment happen. The third one was slower to come around, and when she did, I could see immediately that something was wrong. One of her primary limbs hung at an angle that was not right, not the angle a limb at rest assumes, but the angle of something that had been impacted and was now occupying less space than its natural range of motion would normally allow. The bioluminescence along that limb was muted and irregular, stuttering like a light fixture with a failing connection, while the rest of her skin lit evenly. She kept the limb tucked close against her body as she reoriented, protective and automatic. When she found me and registered my wrist, she did not produce the sharp white pulse the second one had. She produced something slower and more complex, something that moved through a range I had never seen catalogued, long gradients that felt weighted somehow, felt like they had mass. I felt it in my body as a kind of ache, without being able to say why. I said quietly, "You're hurt, I can see you're hurt." No response that I could read. "I'm not going to do anything," I said. "I'm just going to sit here. My name is Rennick, Milo Rennick. I work on this ship." I paused. "Well, I used to. The ship is having some problems right now." They couldn't understand me, almost certainly. I had no translation equipment. It was forward with the rest of the functional gear, with the crew that was still in the habitable section waiting for rescue. But I had noticed, over years of working with non-English speakers, and with people who were injured and disoriented and frightened, that the fact of a quiet voice meant something separate from the words in it. That cadence and tone carried information that content didn't, and that someone talking softly in the dark was recognizable as a specific category of person, not threat, something else, across a surprising range of communication systems. I hoped that was true for Varesi too. The first one, the one with the gold-amber light, shifted on the shelf. Then, slowly, he descended. He moved the way all Varesi moved, with that unhurried precision that looks slow until you map the actual distance covered per movement, and he came down from the shelf and settled on the bay floor about 3 meters from me with a deliberateness that felt like it was chosen, that specific distance, rather than just where he happened to stop. We looked at each other, at something closer to eye level. He extended a secondary limb and pressed the tip of it against his own torso, right at the center of his chest, or what I was mapping as his chest, and held it there for 2 seconds. Then he extended the same secondary limb toward me, making the same pressing gesture in the air between us. I didn't know the meaning, but the structure was recognizable, something given and something offered back in the same gesture, an introduction or an acknowledgement or something that served the function of both. I pressed my hand against my own chest. "Rennick," I said, "Milo Rennick." His light moved. I couldn't read it, but it moved, and that felt like a response. "We've had a very bad day," I told him, "all of us." What happened over the next few hours resists clean summary. I have tried since to write it in a way that conveys what it actually felt like, and the account I have written is accurate and is also insufficient, which I think is just the nature of the material. Some things lose something in the rendering, and you just have to know that going in. There was no common language. Between us we had one mark on a wrist, and whatever that meant to a species I knew only superficially. What there was, practically speaking, was a badly damaged ship, a thinning oxygen supply, a hurt Varesi who needed help I couldn't fully provide, 2 other Varesi who were working out the same calculus as me, whether any of this was survivable, and if so, what the path looked like. I found out in stages, through gesture and the occasional prop. I used the supply crates as a kind of surface to sketch crude diagrams on when words failed, drawing rough ships and debris clouds and rough stick figures in the dust, that they had been in the debris field rather than on the herring before the impact. They had been navigating the outer edge of the Kalen Station breakup, using a transit technique I had heard described in exactly one paper, and not understood. Something about riding the energy wake of a large mass disintegration, using the particle dispersal as a kind of current, which required positioning that put you very close to the debris front. The breakup had been more catastrophic and faster than their models had anticipated. The field had exceeded the parameters of the technique, and the herring, decelerating through the same debris corridor for unrelated reasons, had intercepted them at a moment when they had no ability to alter course, and the impact had carried them through the bay hull in a chain of events that I could reconstruct only roughly. They had been in Bay 7, damaged and disoriented, when the atmosphere had thinned below the threshold their biology could sustain, and they had gone into the suspended state I had found them in. 11 hours upside down in the dark, waiting for something, though they hadn't known what. I explained, with drawings and with gesture, and with a good deal of failed communication that we were both patient about, that the forward section of the ship had about 60 hours of breathable air remaining, but that I needed the atmospheric regulators from the sealed supply crates to maintain it, and that I was also working against the cascade failure of 2 secondary hull systems that were going to become primary hull failures if nobody addressed them in the next 12 or so hours. The one with the gold light, I had started thinking of him as Gold, knowing this was a rough and inadequate shorthand, but needing something, watched all of my explanations with total focused attention. Then he turned to the second Varesi, the one I was thinking of as Blue, and they had a rapid exchange in light and vibration that I could see but not read. Blue moved to the far wall of the bay, ran a secondary limb along the surface in a slow sweep that looked like reading, like someone running a finger along a line of text, stopped at a section that looked to me exactly like every other section of the wall. That section opened. Not broke open, opened, like a door or a panel, swinging inward on an axis I hadn't seen. Inside the revealed space were tools, a compact arrangement of equipment sized for Varesi physiology, stored in a configuration that suggested they'd been placed there recently and with some care. I couldn't have said what most of them did. But the Varesi had clearly known they were there, which meant they had been there before the impact, which meant something about this ship that I was going to have to think about later when I had more cognitive capacity. Blue moved to the supply crates along the bay's far wall, touched each one in sequence with a secondary limb, pausing briefly, moving on. Third crate from the left, longer pause. She looked at me. I checked the manifest stenciled on the crate's side. Atmospheric regulators. I got my pry bar. What followed was 3 hours of the most technically complex and communicatively improvised work I had done in 23 years of salvage. And in salvage, that is saying something. We developed a working language. That is not quite accurate. A working language implies something more formalized than what we actually built, which was more like a set of shared reference points that we accumulated and built on in real time. A specific gesture from Gold came to mean something like, yes, this is the component we need. A specific color shift from Blue came to mean something like, I can see the failure point, follow my limb. When I held a component up and turned it, they understood I was asking, is this the right one? When one of them moved their limb in a particular slow circle, it meant I'm not certain. Check it again. None of this was taught. None of it was negotiated. It just accumulated, correction by correction, the way all working relationships accumulate vocabulary. By using something, seeing whether it works and adjusting. Blue turned out to have a sense of the ship's systems that I could not account for. She would press a secondary limb against a conduit and then signal a direction that I would follow, and at the end of that direction, I would find the actual failure point rather than the apparent failure point, the root problem rather than the symptom. I had no explanation for how she was doing this, and I still don't have a complete one, though people have suggested since that Varesi long transit navigation requires a sensitivity to the structural resonance of large objects that might translate into something like structural intuition about vessel systems. Gold coordinated between us, a constant relay of communication that I could see but not follow. What I could see was its effect. When Gold signaled something to Blue, Blue adjusted her approach. When he signaled to me, often with the body position changes that I had started to read as directive cues, I adjusted mine. The failure rate on our decisions dropped noticeably over the first hour and dropped more over the second. By the third hour, we were operating with a fluency that felt like something earned. Still, the hurt one, who I was thinking of as still because she was mostly motionless in the corner of the bay, and because her light was the quietest of the three, did not participate in the physical work. She sat with her damaged limb carefully folded against her torso, and she watched everything, and she signaled. That is the word for it, signaled. Not randomly, not constantly, but at specific junctures. A particular pattern of light and a specific vibration, and Gold and Blue would pause what they were doing and look at her and adjust. Sometimes the adjustment was to what they were working on. Sometimes the adjustment was to what I was about to do. Gold would redirect me before I made a mistake I hadn't yet made, anticipating it. I recognized this dynamic. I had worked with people who did this. The one who can't lift anymore but still runs the job because their ability to read the situation and predict the next problem is the most valuable thing in the room. I had been that person once, on a retrieval job 3 years out from Mayla's, where I'd broken 2 fingers on day 1 and still ran the operation from the sideline, because I was the only one who had done that type of retrieval before. Still was running this job. From a corner of the bay, injured and in pain, she was navigating work she couldn't physically do herself in a situation she hadn't anticipated in a broken ship she'd never been inside before. She was mapping the territory she could not see. I liked her without being able to articulate why, which is usually a sign that you're responding to something real in another person that you haven't consciously identified yet. Once about 4 hours in, I caught Gold looking at my wrist and then at Still, and the light between them went to something quick and specific. Still's response was longer and moved through a range that felt, to me, weighted. I didn't know what they were saying. I knew it was about the mark. I thought about Myra Ose, about how I had spent weeks, after Riza Station, trying to understand what she had meant by the gesture. About how the databases had told me the gesture existed and what it approximately meant but had not been able to tell me why she had done it to me specifically in that specific moment, or what it obligated. About how I had wondered for a long time afterward whether it had been chosen or reflexive, whether I had been a specific person to her or just whoever happened to be there. About how I had eventually decided that the question was not as important as I had been treating it. The mark was real regardless of the answer. The fact of what she had done was complete in itself. Whether I had mattered to her or been simply the nearest available recipient of the gesture, the corridor was real, the locked doors were real, my leg was real, and she had been there. That was sufficient, it had to be, it was all I had. I had not, until this moment, questioned whether sufficient was actually the right word, or whether I had settled into it the way people settle into an explanation that lets them stop asking. 7 hours into the work, Still moved. I hadn't been watching her closely. I had been focused on a conduit junction that was requiring more attention than any conduit junction should, and when I turned and saw her crossing the floor toward me, it took me a moment to process it. She moved with the same careful deliberateness she used in everything. Each limb placement considered and tested before she committed weight to it. The damaged limb held close and compensated for by the others in a way that suggested long practice with the limitation. She stopped about 2 meters away. I went very still. She extended her right secondary limb, the one on the undamaged side, and pressed the tip of it to the center of her torso in the same gesture Gold had used when he'd come down from the shelf. The introduction gesture, the acknowledgement, the whatever it was that sat in the space between those words. I pressed my hand to my chest. "Rennick," I said. Her light cycled slowly through something I couldn't read. She extended her limb again, this time toward my left hand, not touching, just indicating. I turned my wrist so the inside faced her, the way I had for Gold hours ago. She looked at it for a long time. Her 4 primary eyes moved across the mark in a way that felt methodical, the way you read something rather than just see it. Then she extended her secondary limb again, slowly, slowly enough that I had time to track it and choose not to move, and touched the mark on my wrist with the very tip of it. I held still. My heart did something complicated that I don't have a clean word for. She held the contact, not 3 seconds the way Myra Osei had held it longer, 5 seconds, 6, 7. Her light moved through a long, slow gradient during that time, starting in the violet range and moving through blue and settling into a green that I had never cataloged, a green that felt like it had depth to it, like it was several colors in the same wavelength. I felt the vibration in my sternum and in the base of my jaw, low and sustained. Not the brief, complex burst Gold had produced when he woke, but something longer, something that felt like it was carrying weight. Then she withdrew, and her light stayed in that green range for a moment before beginning a slow return to her resting state, and I sat with what had just happened and tried to find a category for it. I couldn't. Gold had stopped working, blue had stopped working. They were watching still, and watching me, and the light exchange between the three of them was rapid and complex, and went on for nearly a full minute. Then Gold came and stood in front of me and extended his secondary limb and touched the mark on my wrist, holding the contact for the same duration still had. Then Blue did the same, and the mark on my wrist lit up. Very faintly, barely visible in the red emergency light, something I might have dismissed as a trick of the red if I hadn't been watching for it. The bioluminescent compound that Myra Osei had left there, dormant for years, activated by 3 successive contacts in rapid sequence, or by the particular compound these 3 added to it, or by something I don't have the biology to explain. It glowed for something like 45 seconds, and then faded back to its habitual barely there presence. I looked at it while it was glowing. I thought about Myra Osei in the dark with her pale light cycling, cutting doors open, not saying a word. I thought about how some things are complete in themselves, and some things turn out to not be complete, turn out to be the first part of something that has a second part you couldn't have anticipated. I said quietly, "Okay, let's finish this." We finished it. The final stretch was physically the hardest. The sections of the ship that most needed work were also the sections that were technically uninhabitable. Suit seal integrity past its rated duration, atmosphere below functional thresholds, visibility near zero because the emergency strips in those sections had failed, and we were working in the light from 3 sets of bioluminescent skin and 1 flickering torch. I was crawling through spaces designed for cargo, not people, with Gold beside me, and we were routing cable and sealing conduit in the dark by feel and by the pale glow of his resting light. At the junction near the aft primary bulkhead, the worst of the compromised sections, the one still had kept flagging as the critical priority, I got my leg caught. Collapsed junction bracket, shifted by the impact, right at knee height in a space I couldn't stand up in. My right leg, not the one that had been hurt before. My right leg, which had been fine until the bracket shifted, and the bracket shifted because I moved wrong, and then I was in the dark in a zero-atmosphere section with my leg pinned and Gold somewhere ahead of me, and my heart doing the thing it does when the body realizes this might genuinely be the end of the options. For about 3 seconds I was back on Risa Station. Dark corridor, bad air, broken something, no way forward. Then Gold's secondary limb was on my knee, and he was looking at what had the leg, and he worked the bracket free with his secondary tools. The things from the hidden panel, the bonding cutters or whatever they were, in about 4 seconds. Not hurrying, just working with the focused precision that Varesi brought to everything physical, each movement exactly the right one. He did not touch my wrist. He did not make any gesture. He had my leg free and was moving forward to the bulkhead, and I got up and followed him, and neither of us slowed down. There are debts, and there are things that exist in a different register than debt. I was starting to understand in that section of the ship in the dark, with the mark on my wrist faintly warm from where Still and Gold and Blue had touched it, that I had been confused about which category Myra Osei had put me in. That what she had done on Riza Station had not been a transaction. That what was happening in Bay 7 was not a transaction either. That the word I had been using, debt, obligation, what I owe, was not the right word for any of it. I didn't have the right word. I'm not sure there is one in English. The rescue shuttle arrived at hour 68, on schedule, inside the window. Chief Warrant Vance had been updated on the Varese situation through my fragmented comms over the preceding 12 hours, and she had run it up the chain in a way that I discovered later had resulted in some significant institutional scrambling and the rapid assembly of a contact and translation team. By the time the shuttle docked, there were people with proper equipment who knew something about what they were doing. The handoff was not the fraught event it might have been. It was still complicated. Everything in that situation was complicated, but it proceeded with something I could reasonably call professionalism on both sides, and the translation equipment began producing approximate English within the first 20 minutes. I sat against the bay wall and watched the Varese interact with the translation equipment, and it was strange, after all those hours, to see their communication rendered into flat declarative English approximations. Strange in the way that something complex translated to simple is always strange, accurate at the surface, and missing at the depth. Gold's name, the translator eventually said, rendered most closely as the one who calculates the angle of the fall. Blue was the one who listens before speaking. And still, the translator attempted her name several times, producing different versions on each attempt, before settling on a rendering that I thought was probably still wrong but was closer than the previous attempts. The one who maps the territory she cannot see. That one seemed right to me in a way that the others didn't, which probably says something about how much time I'd spent watching her work. The medical team was cautious around still. They had training and equipment for Varese biology, and they used it carefully, assessing the damaged limb with the translation team facilitating, and they determined that the damage was significant and would require extended healing support and specific environmental conditions that were not available on the shuttle but could be arranged at the station. Still received this information through the translation equipment with a composure that I recognized as a particular kind of toughness. The kind that isn't about not hurting, it's about not letting the hurting change what you decide to do next. She came to where I was sitting against the wall before the medics moved her. The translation equipment interfaced between us, and she produced a light pattern, and after a moment the equipment said, "She is asking about the mark." "I know," I said. She produced another pattern. The equipment processed it, a maker of the mark, name. "Myra Osei," I said. "A Varese. I lost contact with her a few years ago. She saved my life on Riza Station and she left the mark and I didn't know what it meant until now." The translation equipment took time with Still's response. There was clearly more content than the equipment could confidently render, and what it offered was partial. She says, "The mark is an oath completion touch, given between parties who have survived together. When given, a bond exists. A bond is not only between the giver and receiver, it extends." She is asking, "Why did you not come to the community when you carried the mark?" I sat with that for a moment. "I didn't know there was a community to come to," I said. "I didn't know the mark meant that. I thought it was a gesture of farewell. I thought it was complete in itself." The equipment produced Still's response. "No gesture is only a gesture." We sat with that in the air between us for a moment, in the way that something true and simple requires a moment after it's said. "Can you find her?" I asked. "Myra Osei, is that possible to tell her what happened here?" Still looked at me with all four primary eyes for a long time. Her light moved slowly through a pattern I couldn't follow. The equipment said, "She says she does not need to be told. She says she will know." I didn't know what to do with that except accept it. I had stopped requiring the literal sense of things several hours ago, somewhere in the dark of the aft section with my leg pinned and Gold's secondary limbs working free the bracket. The literal sense was not the only sense, and insisting on it as the primary one had been causing me to miss things for years. "Okay," I said. Still touched my wrist again before the medics moved her through the process of transfer. She held the contact longer than she had before, nearly a full minute, and the mark lit up again, brighter this time, and the light from the mark pulsed in a slow rhythm that matched the bioluminescence moving across her skin as she held the contact. I watched them sync. I did not have a word for what I was watching, a word in any language I knew, and I had stopped feeling bothered by not having the word. The shuttle bay was full of organized activity, the specific controlled busyness of professional people doing complicated things in a limited space, and I sat against the wall and watched all of it and thought about Myra Osai. I had looked for her in the year after Risa Station. Not obsessively. I had a ship, I had work, I had a life that demanded more of me than it gave back most months. But I had looked, sent queries through the cooperative databases, sent messages through the 2 channels I had been told sometimes reached Varesi communities in the outer corridors, not really expecting a response. Nothing had come back. And after a while I had arrived at an explanation that felt right and that let me stop looking. Some things are not meant to resolve. A kindness given in the dark of a corridor and a mark left on a wrist are complete in themselves. The absence of a return address does not diminish them. She had been there, I had been there, and the fact of it was sufficient without an afterwards. What I was reconsidering now was whether I had arrived at that explanation because it was true, or because I had needed to arrive somewhere and it was the closest destination. Gold came and settled near me while I was thinking this, not close, a respectful distance, but clearly deliberate rather than incidental. His bioluminescence was in the low amber gold of his resting state, the state I had come to read over the hours as something like ease, something like settled. He was not going to make me figure out what he was communicating. He was just going to be there. We sat together in the organized chaos of the handoff, and neither of us said anything. After a while he extended his secondary limb and rested the tip of it against the floor between us, not touching me, just present. I put my left hand on the floor next to it, wrist up, mark visible. The mark caught the light from his skin and held it, the 2 glows occupying the same air between us. That was enough. It did not need to be more than that. I have told the story since, to various people, in various abbreviated forms. I have told it to Vance over drinks, who listened without interrupting, which is how I knew she thought it mattered. I have told it to the debrief officer who needed an account of the Bay system's restoration, and found the interpersonal elements interesting but not relevant to her report, which was fair. I have told it to my sister who said, "That is the most Milo thing that has ever happened to Milo," and then asked if I wanted to hear about her kitchen renovation, which was also fair. What I cannot fully convey in any of these tellings is the texture of those hours. The specific quality of working alongside something entirely other, not despite the difference, not in spite of it, but inside it, with the difference as a constant present fact and the work happening anyway, the understanding accumulating anyway, the shared vocabulary building itself out of nothing in real time. The experience did not teach me that humans and Varesi are secretly similar. We are not secretly similar. We are built differently. We perceive differently. We communicate in forms that don't map onto each other. We navigate space differently and time differently, and probably meaning differently in ways I can't even identify because they operate below my ability to notice. The difference is real and large, and I am not going to paper over it with sentiment. What the experience taught me, if it taught me anything, is that large differences don't preclude understanding. They just require that you don't mistake your picture of the other person for the actual other person, that you stay in contact with what is actually in front of you rather than what you have decided to believe about it. I had for years carried a picture of Myra Osai that was built out of 3 hours in a dark corridor and a mark on my wrist and the documents I had read afterward. That picture was accurate as far as it went. It just didn't go very far, and I had been treating it as complete. The mark is still on my wrist. Whatever still and gold and blue added to it, the addition was permanent, deeper, or more established, or simply reinforced by the additional compound. In certain light, at certain angles without trying, I can see it clearly. A tracing on the inside of my left wrist, pale and complex, glowing from within by something that has no clean biological explanation in the databases I have checked and that I have stopped trying to explain. Still recovered. I received a report on that through the translation cooperative that was formally established in the wake of the Bay 7 contact. Apparently the contact itself had prompted the establishment of administrative infrastructure that had been needed for some time and that nobody had gotten around to building until there was a concrete reason. Still's limb healed over the course of several months with support, and she returned to transit. I don't know where she is now. I don't need to know. Blue filed something with the Veresi Cooperative Archive. The translation cooperative rendered it, imperfectly, as an account of the contact classified under a category that translated as instances of oath bond activation at remove. What that meant, as far as I could determine, was that the mark Myra Osei had left carried forward beyond the original contact, that it had properties in Veresi practice that meant it could activate in circumstances like Bay 7, that when 3 Veresi encountered the mark of an oath bond, they were within the scope of that bond, whether or not the original bond maker was present, that the obligations Myra Osei had taken on when she touched my wrist extended, and gold and blue and still had been operating inside those obligations from the moment they saw the mark. I sat with that for a long time when I first read it. Myra Osei had not just saved my life on Risa Station. She had incorporated me into something, not by accident and not as a transaction and not as a gesture of farewell. She had made a choice that had consequences she knew about and that I hadn't understood until Bay 7, and she had made it in 3 seconds in the dark of an emergency airlock, and then she had left. I don't know what to do with that except find it extraordinary. Gold sent me something through the cooperative channels. Not a message. The cooperative was specific that it wasn't a message in any sense I would have recognized. A recorded pattern. A sequence of light pulses rendered in a medium the cooperative could relay, which the translator said could not be fully rendered in English, but that carried meaning in the approximate range of the calculation that finds the correct angle of arrival. I keep it filed on my comm under his name, the name I gave him. I don't know what he calls himself. I know what that pattern feels like when I play it back, like something that was looking for its landing and found it. I think about Still sometimes, when the work is difficult, about how she sat in the corner of the bay with a damaged limb and ran probability maps of a territory she could not see. About how she was right about 80% of the time and wrong about 20%, and wrong in ways that she incorporated immediately and corrected. About how she didn't stop because the territory was unfamiliar. About how unfamiliar territory is the only territory worth mapping. I think about Myra Osei in the dark with her pale cycling light, cutting through 2 locked doors, not saying a single word. I press my thumb against the inside of my left wrist sometimes, when the day has been the kind of day that accumulates. The mark is warm slightly when I do that. Not always, not on command, just sometimes in the way of living things it responds to contact. There are things that happen in the outer transit corridors that don't make it into debrief reports. Things that resist the flat English of translation equipment. Things that exist in the register between what can be said and what is true. They happen anyway in the dark, between people and non-people who don't share a language and who build one anyway, and the mark they leave on each other is real whether or not you have a word for it, and it carries forward whether or not you know it will. Myra Osei knew. I think that's the part I keep coming back to. She knew. She made a choice in a 3-second window in an emergency airlock with a stranger she'd spent 2 hours helping drag through a dying corridor, and the choice was not a transaction and not a gesture and not an accident. It was a choice. It was an act of incorporation. It was, you are inside this now. You will carry this now. And when you need it, it will know you. I did not come to the community because I did not know the community was there. But the Mark knew. The Mark had always known. And when 3 Varesi found themselves hanging upside down in a broken bay with limited atmosphere and no way forward, the Mark was there, and it was enough. I don't know what you call that. I think the Varesi have a word for it. I think the word is a kind of light. I think the light is the kind that finds you in the dark of a corridor when you have stopped being sure anything is going to find you, and I think it doesn't ask you to understand it fully in order to follow it. I press my thumb against the inside of my wrist. The Mark is warm. We are still here. There is a particular quality to the outer transit corridors that you either make peace with or you don't. The distances are enormous, and the timescales are geological, and most of what you do out there is wait, and what you find when you arrive is usually broken or missing or not what you expected. You develop over years a tolerance for the gap between what you plan and what you find. You develop a capacity to work inside uncertainty rather than against it. Or you leave. A lot of people leave. I had stayed because the work suited something in my temperament that I had never been able to name precisely. Not patience. I am not a patient person in the ordinary sense. Something more like a willingness to not know how things end while the work is still ongoing. To stay in the middle of a problem without the problem being resolved, and to find that tolerable, and to keep working. Bay 7 had tested that capacity in ways I hadn't anticipated. Not because the situation was worse than other situations I'd worked. I have been in worse situations, structurally speaking. But because the uncertainty in Bay 7 wasn't just about outcomes. It was about what was actually happening, what the light between gold and still and blue was carrying. What the gesture gold had made when he first came down from the shelf actually meant. Not in the approximate way I was reading it, but in its full meaning to the people using it. What Still's prolonged silence was doing when she sat in the corner, thinking, navigating, enduring all of these. None of these. Something that didn't have a word in my category system. The not knowing sat differently than structural not knowing. It sat in a place I didn't usually have to access. I had spent a lot of years being effective at things I didn't fully understand. That's salvage. You don't understand why a ship went the way it went. You reconstruct it, imperfectly from the evidence. You don't understand why the systems failed the way they failed. You model it, roughly from what you find, but you work on it anyway. You fix what you can fix. You stabilize what you can stabilize. You get the people out or you get the cargo out or both if you're lucky, and you move on to the next job. What Bay 7 required was being effective at something I didn't understand while also staying genuinely open to what I didn't understand. Not just working around the gap, working in contact with it, letting the fact that I didn't fully know what was happening be a real fact rather than a problem to be managed away. I think the 3 of them were doing the same thing with me. I think Gold, the first time he came down from the shelf and settled 3 meters away and looked at me, was holding himself in contact with an enormous unknown and choosing to work inside it rather than wait until he understood it fully, which he would never do. I think Blue, when she went to the supply crates and ran her secondary limb along them and paused at the 3rd one and looked at me, was making a choice to extend trust into a situation she couldn't fully see. I think Still, when she crossed the floor in the 7th hour and touched the mark on my wrist and held it, was doing something that required all the steadiness she had, not because she was afraid of me, but because what she was doing mattered, and things that matter require steadiness to do correctly. We were all in that bay doing the same work, the practical work and the other work, the one underneath it, the one that doesn't have a clean name. The rescue shuttle arriving felt like the moment a held breath releases. Not relief, exactly. There was still too much to manage for pure relief. But a change in the quality of time, a sense that the middle of the problem had an end to it after all, that the story we were inside had a chapter break coming. I had been inside a lot of stories. The ones in Bay 7 were different from the others. I can't tell you precisely how. I know that when gold settled near me at the end, while the handoff was happening around us, and neither of us said anything, what I felt was something I hadn't expected to feel. Not relief, not exhaustion, not the particular flatness that follows high adrenaline work. Something more like rightness. The sense that the shape of the thing that had happened was appropriate to the weight of it, that we had been in the middle of something real and we had carried it to the end of its middle, and what was left was real too. I did not expect to miss him. I was surprised to find, when the shuttle departed and the station came into view through the viewport, that I was already cataloging the things I hadn't been able to say and probably never would be able to say, not to him, not in any form that would cross the gap. That's how you know something mattered, not when it ends well, when it ends and you're already thinking about what you would have wanted more time to understand. The mark is warm when I press it. I think she knew it would be.